This video has been brought to you by Squarespace. Did you know that before the turn of the century, New York was already well on its way to becoming a city of towers? The first class of skyscrapers were bizarre, as they were aspiring to be modern, yet they cling to the beauty of the architecture from Europe's past. One building that comes to mind is the lost St. Paul building, designed by George B. Post, constructed between 1895 and 1898. This masterpiece once towered over Lower Manhattan's financial district as one of the first and tallest skyscrapers in New York City at 26 stories and 315 feet tall. Its iconic style colonnades stood out from the other superstructures of its time, but it was also this very same unique style that made it one of the most critically received buildings in the city's history. In the modern day, the story of St. Paul's building has long been lost to time, but today we will bring it back to life. So join me in uncovering its history as we discover the rise and fall of St. Paul Tower. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start by first taking a look at New York's economic growth in the 19th century. New York has long been one of America's premier trading and transportation hubs, contributing significantly to the development of the country's economy. During the 1800s, it began to arise as the leading port city in America, in large thanks to its location. Because it was more central than Boston or Charleston, it made it easier for European manufacturers to ship to New York City, which would then distribute the goods across the rest of the country. Additionally, the port's depth and natural protection from storms and ice also made it even more desirable. Its great depth could accommodate larger and heavier ships that came and went with the development of transatlantic commerce. Over time, New York City developed what is called a hub and spoke system. And within the system, New York City served as a central hub where shipments were sent. From there, the goods would then be distributed to the spokes, or the other states and territories of America. Cotton and tobacco for the southern states would first be shipped to New York and then loaded onto larger ships in order to make the journey over to Europe. Ships making the return trip would be loaded with many different kinds of manufactured goods and textiles to be brought back to New York City and distributed across the country. By 1860, New York's port had become indispensable to not only the East Coast but the entirety of America. And by that time, New York had heavily established itself in manufacturing trades such as sugar refining, the garment trade, and even printing and publishing. However, the city's growth was not just in economics or trade. New York's population grew exponentially thanks to the bustling port and trade system, which opened a large number of jobs. European immigrants came seeking work in increasing numbers, and the developing modes of transportation ensured that laborers could commute longer distances. In fact, by this time, it was handling more goods and people than all of the other American ports combined. This significant growth helped bring about the first skyscrapers in the late 19th century, as developments in technology and construction allowed for buildings to reach higher than ever before. The rise of New York City's skyscrapers started around 1868 with the construction of buildings over 6 floors that were equipped with hydraulic passenger elevators. Geographic Guide reports that most of these early buildings were built by insurance companies, newspapers, or hotels. In fact, it was not uncommon for insurance companies to display their dominance through skyscrapers. Even all the way across the ocean, here in Warsaw, Poland, Prudential put up what was the tallest pre-war building. And the similarities are striking. Key differences being, this one is about 30 years younger than the St. Paul Tower and narrowly escaped a very abysmal fate. Among these early buildings were the 6-story Grand Hotel, the 7-story Equitable Life building on Broadway, and the 8-story Bristol Hotel in 1875. However, as technology increased even further, construction would see far more improvements. And these were improvements on little things that we simply take for granted today. For example, lighting a skyscraper. You see, back in the 1800s, using gas lighting was not only difficult but risky on higher floors. But thanks to the innovations of electricity, lighting the upper floors of buildings was both more convenient and significantly reduced the fire hazard from candles and lanterns. Similarly, higher floors would also need to be readily supplied with water, which was solved with advancements in plumbing. At the time, wooden floor-mounted water towers were mandatory installations for buildings that were more than 6 stories tall because high water pressure ran the risk of bursting municipal water pipes. The construction of such large buildings also required innovations in construction to support the immense weight of the towering height. The use of massive steel frames provided the necessary structural support, while foundations were dug deeper than ever before, down to bedrock to provide a sturdy base. Elevators were also a must-have to provide access to higher floors. At that time, to be considered a skyscraper, a building had to have at least 10 floors, though in the 20th century, this bar would be raised substantially as it had become far too attainable by then. The rise of skyscrapers was also largely due to their placement. As transportation grew and more people flocked to live in urban areas, there was an increased need for office space to house workers. They were primarily built in the heart of the city near pre-established centers of commerce. This provided accessibility while it was decently far away from the slums and manufacturing districts. So now that we've laid the groundwork for the St. Paul Tower, let's quickly learn about the man behind the marvel. Born on December the 15th, 1837, the often overlooked George B. Post was a New York architect who contributed significantly to the city in his time. Aside from the St. Paul Tower, by the time of his death on November the 28th, 1913, this architect's portfolio was filled with landmarks. From the New York Stock Exchange building to Cornelius Vanderbilt's French Chateau on Fifth Avenue, his reach extended as far as Chicago and Detroit, where he worked on the incredibly luxurious Stadler Hotel and the highly praised Manufacturers and Liberal Arts buildings at the 1893 Chicago's World Fair. His career began with studies at the School of Civil Engineering and Architecture at the University of New York, and it was there that he studied alongside his later mentor, Richard Morris Hunt, who was, according to Historic Detroit, referred to as American architecture's first and in many ways greatest statesman. He formed a partnership in 1860 with American architect Charles D. Gambrill, though he began his own practice in 1867. That same year, he entered a competition to design the Equitable Life Assurance Society building, and while he didn't win the competition, he was appointed as consulting architect who handled ironwork, vaults, and elevators. In 1869 and 1870, Post designed 3 now demolished buildings for the College of New Jersey in Princeton, and in 1875, Post designed the Williamsburg Savings Bank building, Chicory Hall, and Western Union building. Over the years, Post would continue to pioneer methods of construction, especially those that had to do with designing large interior spaces. One such method made apt use of the repeated openings to create large interior spaces, which was perhaps best described by Sarah Bradford Landau in her book George B. Post Architect, Picturesque Designer, and Determined Realist as extraordinarily rhythmic. This method would go on to influence Richardson's Marshall Fields wholesale store and Adler and Sullivan's auditorium building in Chicago, and undoubtedly countless more. From 1889 to 1890, Post worked on designs for the Pulitzer Building, also known as the World Building, and the way he won the commission for that project was peculiar and bold. Right after he submitted his plans, he approached Joseph Pulitzer himself and daringly made a bet against him that he could stay within the $3 million budget. Although he lost the bet, he succeeded in bringing his design to life. The Pulitzer Building takes the crown of one of the tallest buildings in New York City, standing at 309 feet tall and 20 stories high. According to Landau, its concept was of a multi-level Renaissance palazzo topped with a domed temple. Just 5 years later, Post would manage to top this building with a completely new design, one that would define his career going forward. In 1895, Post was commissioned by avid art collector and president of the American Sugar Refining Company, Henry Osborne Havemeyer, to design the St. Paul building, something that would, upon completion, eclipse even the Pulitzer building, which had been completed in 1890. And in this phase of the career, the architect started to display some rather interesting contradictions, as he supported legislation that would limit building heights even while he was in the middle of planning one of his very own and tallest skyscrapers. He had this to say on the topic: "Our narrow streets, when lined with tall structures, will become unhealthy alleys with inadequate capacity for the passengers and crowds which will flow from these tall buildings if occupied, for the capacity of the streets is already severely taxed at certain times of the day." He also stated that whether they were well designed or not, the sides and rear of tall buildings would still form a hideous mass, and it was precisely because of these reservations that the St. Paul building was designed the way it was. Post took advantage of the irregular shape of the plot it occupied on Broadway, Park Row, and Ann Street, deliberately designing it so its rear was 4 stories lower than the Broadway side. It was also set back at the 19th floor by around 20 feet on the Ann Street side. The steel skeleton frame was designed to prevent potential corrosion and fire damage. It was also braced against the wind. The repeated classical order and limestone paid homage to its namesake, the St. Paul's Chapel, as well as the columned facades of the post office building and City Hall. It included a group of 3 sculptures designed by the Austrian-born sculptor Karl Bitter, titled Radical Unity. The piece depicted 3 stone Atlantes holding up parts of the building. Its incredibly detailed facade was cantilevered from floors to grinders. The main structural members were then placed inside the pier face to protect them both from heat and moisture. All of its 26 stories were stacked with repeating Ionic orders. The classical cornices were reminiscent of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. The base of the building was made up of the first 4 stories and had rusticated blocks. Icon-style piers between the windows supported the cornices above every even-numbered story, while the 21st story, considered a transitional story, was engraved with panels between each of its windows. The top 5 stories of the building comprised the building's capital, with passerbyers able to see the 22nd through 25th floor from street level. The 22nd story had pedestals that supported columns and engraved panels, and the 26th floor was lit up by skylights and hidden by the parapet at the very top of the building. Construction of the St. Paul building began with the demolition of the old New York Herald headquarters, which had occupied the site since Burnham's American Museum burnt down in 1865. Builders carried out foundational tests in early 1896 to ensure that the soil was considered consistent enough, and construction began shortly afterwards. The bedrock under the St. Paul Tower was around 87 feet deep, and the ground above it was overlaid with fine sand. While other skyscrapers of its time dug down to the underlying bedrock, builders instead dug 31.5 feet deep, which was also this building's sub-basement level. Test loads were then placed on the sand to see if it would sink. This helped determine whether or not the sand was stable. After it was deemed satisfactory, a layer of concrete was spread out along the base to distribute the building's weight alongside its steel base properly. As opposed to other steel buildings in the area, the St. Paul building did not use piles, thanks to the sand being already highly compacted. Hydraulic jack screws were installed at the bottom of the columns. Although no workers died, tragedy struck during early construction in May of 1896, when workers on the 12th story were lifting a heavy iron girder. The fastenings gave way, causing the girder to slip out of place, striking a stone on the 6th floor and knocking it loose. The stone fell and struck a 30-year-old and passerby named Henry Leach, who had been driving a brick wagon and had just dumped a load of bricks onto the Ann Street side of the St. Paul Tower. The St. Paul building was completed in 1898 at a price of approximately $1.1 million, or the equivalent of $28 million today. It briefly took the title as one of New York City's tallest buildings, alongside the Pulitzer Building, though in 1899 the Park Row building surpassed it. This great tower was used as an office building with many notable tenants, such as Outlook magazine, where former President Theodore Roosevelt served as associate editor, and tenants enjoyed 6 elevators in total, which were an absolute luxury for the time. Its ornate limestone facade stood out against the rapidly changing New York City skyline. The building was equipped with a water tank and over 300 feet of vertical piping to accommodate the incredibly high pressure that ran through the building's standpipe system. Throughout its lifespan, thousands of people flocked to admire the skyscraper's unusual design, but not everyone was fond of it. Now, these critics' voices were heard in ways that can't be undone, and it's where the story of St. Paul's Tower really gets interesting. But before we get into that, let's check out Squarespace. Have you ever wondered how to make your voice heard, or how to spread knowledge about a topic you love? Well, I'd suggest starting a webpage with Squarespace, the sponsor of this video and a service I adore and have used for years. So here are some of their top features. First off are the blogging tools, which are fantastic and support a configurable share button, letting your visitors share content around the web. For me, Squarespace's blogging tools have replaced Instagram, as their easy-to-use features allow me to share my experience in a more noble, gallery-like environment. I've also gained powerful insights into who's visiting my site, as well as how they're interacting with in-depth website analytic tools, including page views, traffic sources, time on site, most read content, audience geography, and more. I'm also considering using the Squarespace members area for our History Council group, as this service connects the audience with gated members-only content, where creators can manage members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights, all on one easy-to-use platform. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/itshistory to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Despite this, the St. Paul building was met quite harshly by critics who had no love for its unusual design and structure. Montgomery Schuyler was one such critic, stating that it denied the natural similarity of building stories. Others had pointed out that in the context of the shoe and leather bank building at Broadway and Chambers, the city now had 2 domineering structures on Park Row that swore at each other. Additionally, it was one of Post's least favorite buildings that he had ever designed, a fact that one writer at Real Estate Record picked up on with a comment that the St. Paul building offered Paul the occasion to say, "I told you so," at his own expense. As such, it seemed that the St. Paul building was destined to live a tragically short life. In fact, the owners started considering selling the building alongside with the Metropolitan Commercial Building as early as 1919. However, the St. Paul building was not actually sold by the family until April 1943, when they sold it to Webb and Knapp. A few years later, the Chase National Bank bought the St. Paul building for cash, which at the time was assessed at around just above $1 million, with an annual rent income of $150,000. In 1957, AT&T's Western Electric division started to make plans for its own building that would replace the St. Paul building after its demolition. And just a year later, in 1958, the St. Paul building was demolished and officially replaced by the Western Electric building, which was completed in 1962. And perhaps at best, we could describe this new building's lack of character as nondescript. But by now, you might be wondering, does anything remain of the St. Paul building today? Well, in August of 1958, the Committee to Preserve American Art was formed to help save works of art and buildings set to be demolished. The sculptures alone were valued at around $150,000 and were in incredibly high demand. Many large organizations put in requests for the sculptures, including but not limited to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Columbia University. Others instead suggested paying respect to their sculptor Karl Bitter by moving the sculptures to his home country of Austria. Though initially Western Electric seemingly had little interest in saving the statues, the proposal and request made by those who wanted them were thankfully able to sway those in charge. The sculptures were removed along with a section of the ground floor facade following a contest to determine their fate. Indianapolis-born artist Elmer Tafflinger won this contest. According to Tafflinger's design, the 8-ton statues would find a permanent home in Indianapolis, Indiana. They were to be installed into a recreation of the St. Paul facade at a reflecting foundation pool with dual geysers. Though for a time their future remained uncertain, the statues sat in crates for almost 2 years after their arrival until finally being placed in Holiday Park. However, it took even longer for Tafflinger's plans to be implemented. As time went on, and funds along with certainty on what the completed monument should look like, enthusiasm fluctuated and eventually dwindled. The project's progress slowed to a crawl. Eventually, it was declared a safety hazard, and Western Electric expressed regret over awarding this incredible statue to Indianapolis due to the poor treatment they had received. However, all hope for the future of Bitter's statues was not lost. Historic Indianapolis attributes Mayor Richard Lugar's push to complete the project, which was over a decade old at that point, to fears that New York would try to take the figures back, and then a second major effort to finish what had been started took place in 1970. At long last, the ruins were officially dedicated in 1973. However, they remained a work in progress for many years as Tafflinger continued to think of ways to improve and change the design. Tafflinger had grand visions for the monument's future, many of which came to fruition. The proposed additions were as followed. Giant slabs of limestone were carved with the first 13 words of the Constitution, 13 fir trees representing the 13 colonies, and 51 boxwood trees to represent each state in Washington, D.C. Following Tafflinger's passing in 1981, the rest of his ideas slowly fell into obscurity. In 1994, the plans to dismantle the ruins in order to construct a new nature center on the plot were announced. However, they were met with public outrage that thus kept Bitter's statues from relocating a second time. And then 2 decades later, actions were taken to restore these ruins to their former glory. Efforts which can still be enjoyed today by the Friends of Holiday Park, who hope to restore the monument while still staying true to Tafflinger's incredible vision. Well, the reception of St. Paul's building was incredibly divided. I'd argue that its unique structure is what made it so special and such a tragic loss. And whether or not we agree with what the critics say, there's something to be considered when it comes to posts thinking outside of the box and taking risks, which sometimes paid off. And now, the last relic of this phase of the architect's career are hundreds of miles from where they were intended to be displayed, but at least something was saved. So let me know what you think about the building's design and whether or not it was a tragedy or a blessing that the St. Paul Tower was demolished. For more tales of urban decay, check out our playlist. Click join to become a historical preservationist producer, and don't forget to subscribe. This is Ryan Socash signing off.